My name is Evangeline Athanasiou. I am a graduate student at the University of Maryland, and my paper is entitled The Baroque Voice, a study in the perception of Baroque solo vocal literature among University of Maryland voice students. On November 4th, 2017, the Washington National Opera premiered a production of Handel's Alcina, the first Baroque opera to reach the Kennedy Center stage in almost 10 years. On their website, in the short blurb accompanying a magnificently unmistakable shot of Angela Meade, is a subtle yet revealing statement. Matched to the intimate acoustics of the Eisenhower Theater, Alcina harkens to the magnificent tradition of grand Handelian singing, with world-class vocal talents impeccably suited to every sumptuous role. Don't miss this extraordinary opportunity to fall under the spell of one of opera's brightest jewels, rarely performed until the perfect cast makes it well worth the wait. At first, this flattering statement may seem like a conventional attempt at grabbing the reader's interests. However, upon further examination, two small details struck me with curiosity. The first is that, according to Manfred Retzer's ongoing performance tally in the Handel Jahrbuch, Alcina is in fact the third most frequently performed Handel opera in the repertory to date, behind only Giulio Cesare and Circe. It seems as though this was an exaggeration meant to draw attention to a perfect cast. The second point I noticed is the continued emphasis placed on the suitability of the WNO's casting choices. Indeed, after I explored the rest of the website, this emphasis proved an exception among the other 5 operas available under the WNO's upcoming productions. These included works by Verdi, Rossini, Bernstein, and Portman, and in their descriptions, the website author did not feel it necessary to assure the potential ticket buyer that those operas were cast appropriately. This subtle message on the WNO's webpage is part of a larger conversation which I have frequently found myself overhearing and indeed participating in the world of vocal performance. Hierarchical notions of voice types aside, there was certainly a prescriptive norm of particular kinds of voices suited and not suited for Baroque repertoire among students and teachers in my undergraduate institution. When I began to sense similar assumptions after joining the musical community at the University of Maryland, what I once considered an isolated belief of a single institution now showed the potential of a large-scale notion of who can or should sing Baroque repertoire and who can't or shouldn't. As this notion was communicated almost entirely as word of mouth and taken as common law, I was eager to gather quantitative data to support a previously unmeasured singer's perception of the Baroque voice. With a foundation in scholarship by Mary Hunter and various performance practice studies of the late 20th and early 21st centuries, this study argues that performance institutions are still overcoming a previous generation's preference for historical performance voice practices. I'll first take a closer look at reviews of Alcina and the assumptions they reveal about what constitutes a Baroque voice. Then, I'll introduce the survey I administered to the University of Maryland voice students and analyze the results of their responses. Finally, I'll address just one of the potentially numerous underlying issues fueling the concept of a Baroque voice. By analyzing data collected from a survey of University of Maryland voice students, this study presents evidence of a long-perpetuated notion of a specific voice type suited to Baroque music, and the mostly neglected and perhaps detrimental effects of this notion within a music institution. The reviews of Angela Meade's performance at the WNO highlight a handful of assumptions of the Baroque voice. By attempting to convince the reader of the suitability of its casting choices, the WNO indirectly acknowledged that their decision did not fit popular assumptions surrounding the perceived Baroque voice. These assumptions surfaced nonetheless in reviews. Although many reviewers congratulated Meade on her performance in Alcina, most did so with a subtle or not-so-subtle element of surprise when addressing her participation in a Baroque opera. Not only is Alcina female-focused, but it is also Baroque. Well done to the WNO for this unanticipated choice. This quote from Molly Kuroch of Broadway World, Washington, D.C. is one of many examples of the supportive feedback for Alcina. However, it is interesting to note the need, once again, to prove that this production was indeed Baroque, despite certain choices made by the WNO, which go unspecified by Kuroch. Mary Hunter, in her article Historically Informed Performance, observed that the use of relatively well-known singers of mainstream operatic repertory locate the works in a Baroque period that feels entirely familiar to the majority of opera and concert goers, rather than presenting a field trip to another musical era. In the case of WNO's Alcina, however, it seems as though most reviewers were extremely aware of and unable to move past Mead's well-established ties to 19th century dramatic repertoire. For example, one reviewer compared the leading lady's voice with that of the singer in the supporting role, Morgana, providing further evidence of the notion of Baroque music belonging to a certain voice type. For the Maryland Theatre Guide, Brett Dodson writes, "Though fitting of the witch's authoritative ways, Mead's treatment of the style is often too aggressive for the intricacies of the music to be heard. Her aria that closes the first half is more reserved, and resultingly beautiful." The audience favorite of the evening was Ying Fang as Morgana, and rightly so. Her bright and agile voice fit like a stylistic glove and provided some breathtaking bits of artistry. Dodson's language implies that Fang was the rightful favorite of the audience because of her voice type, while Mead treated the style too aggressively. But what exactly is wrong with an aggressive approach to a character that is love-crazed, angry, and paranoid for most of the opera? Indeed, it would seem that it is not her approach, but once again her voice type that is the issue for the reviewer. Similarly, Susan Galbraith wrote for the DC theater scene, "Mead has a voice so enormous you can see why the whole opera world has succumbed. At times it seemed a little too heavy for the work." At her best moments, she reeled in the audience with impossibly soft yet audible pianissimos, then suddenly pulled out the stops in a raging voice that thundered through the Eisenhower Auditorium. It is unclear whether or not Galbraith considers these thunderous outbursts appropriate for the repertoire. However, considering her previous point that, in certain moments, Mead's voice was too heavy, it seems that she preferred the moments of impossibly soft yet audible pianissimos. These clear notions of a voice suited to Baroque music, or in Mead's case, unsuited to Baroque music, are anything but novel. Since the enthusiastic rise of historical performance and the subsequent surge of the early music movement in the 20th century, each generation has constructed their own idealistic Baroque voice. In Hunter's words, what counts as historically informed singing changes rapidly from one generation of singers to another. Over 40 years ago, scholar Anthony Ransom believed that a singer engaged in Baroque repertoire should display a freedom of resonance, an ability to color the voice considerably as necessary, and reserves of volume for use where circumstances require it. Ransom is more concerned here for technical ability and a range of colors and dynamics, rather than naturally endowed size or quality. This era's preference welcomed participation in Baroque opera from famous singers such as Marilyn Horne and Janet Baker, whose voices were and are still considered dark, rich, and with a wider vibrato. 40 years after Ransom's description, as Mary Hunter has suggested and as the Alcina reviews demonstrate, the ideal Baroque voice has changed. Hunter explains, "At the time of writing, despite overwhelming evidence of enormous variability in the 17th and 18th centuries, the default early music voice in modern times has a light timbre, great agility, a narrow vibrato, and clear diction." With Hunter's words as a starting point, I set out to craft a survey of University of Maryland voice students that provides quantitative data to support this rather abstract and often overlooked perception of a Baroque voice, and gauge how this perception may be affecting singers' participation in Baroque repertoire. The target population for this study was undergraduate and graduate voice and music education, opera, and pedagogy students enrolled in the University of Maryland School of Music. For data collection strategies, I consulted Adam Grise, a PhD student in University of Maryland's Music Education Department. He cleaned the dataset and ran a variety of statistical analyses at my request, providing these results. In order to boost survey participation, we offered coffee, tea, and cups labeled with the survey link to all enrolled voice majors in the building for 8 hours straight. The survey was eventually completed by 36 voice majors, yielding an overall response rate of 51%. The items on the survey consisted of 34 questions related to the students' experiences with, interest in, and perceptions of Baroque solo vocal literature. The survey allowed students to choose their Fach or from a variety of response options in a two-part question, first their range, then specifying quality. For example, a singer like Angela Mead would first have chosen soprano from the range options and would have subsequently been offered another set of descriptive terms, from which she may have chosen dramatic. There were several important trends that emerged from the University of Maryland voice students' responses. As the scope of this paper permits, the following results, while very informative, are only a fraction of the collected data. As shown in the image, results for the main survey point, "My voice is suited to Baroque solo vocal literature," reflected Mary Hunter's observations regarding what she referred to as the default early music voice. Undergrads with a light voice have about a 91% chance of agreeing that their voice is suited for Baroque music, while undergrads with a non-light voice have about a 50-50 chance to agree with the same statement. In addition to this statistically significant result, there is also a non-statistically significant trend nonetheless, and graduate students combined on this same survey point. I have also extracted samples of open-ended responses from students who wanted to explain their choice for why they thought their voice was suited to Baroque repertoire, or why they did not. Here are two responses from singers who identified their voices as suited to Baroque solo vocal literature. The first reads, "My voice is extremely flexible and can easily execute melismas. I also have a light and shimmery tone, which is good for Baroque repertoire." The second has a similar explanation. "I have been described as a soubrette soprano, so my voice is pretty high and its lightness typically lends itself to Baroque." Both explanations identify the lighter quality of their voice and immediately connect that lightness with a suitability for Baroque repertoire, without further explanation. The third sample is from a student who identified as a non-light voice, but claimed their voice was suited for Baroque music. The student writes, "Although I have a fuller, darker voice, it tends to enjoy faster passages of coloratura. While people do not tend to cast or select me for this rep, I enjoy it, and my voice fits it." Here, the singer themselves is not under the impression that Baroque music requires a certain Fach. Instead, they draw attention to the institutionalized exclusion of non-light voices from Baroque repertoire, despite the students' expressed interest. I present the final selection from this open-ended question as an example of the Baroque voice as perceived by someone who does not consider their own voice to fit the mold. "My voice, though young, has dramatic qualities. By dramatic, I mean that I tend to be quite loud, and the timbre doesn't generally fit well with a Baroque orchestra. When I sing it, I feel that I am overly controlling of my sound, and I always feel vocally fatigued and pinched after singing in the Baroque style." In this case, the singer has either been told, or more likely has witnessed, that singers with a dramatic sound need to either hold back in an unhealthy way or else be considered unstylistic. As this selected quote, as well as the initial bar graph, have demonstrated, there are singers at the University of Maryland who do not think their voice is suited to Baroque music. Despite their opinions of their voice's suitability, there was an incredible interest among voice students in training in Baroque performance practice. Not a single student who participated in the survey disagreed with the statement, "The opportunity for training in Baroque performance practice would be beneficial to my future career." The results suggest that students are aware of opportunities for performing Baroque repertoire and are interested in learning whatever it is that will qualify them for those gigs. However, while there is a great interest in learning Baroque performance practice skills, there is also a great sense of intimidation surrounding Baroque historical performance for the voice. 29 of the 36 surveyed students, that is 77%, agreed that they considered Baroque performance practice an intimidating area of study, while only 7 of the 36 disagreed. The accessible wealth of Baroque music, as well as scholarly sources on performance practice available to singers from music libraries and online resources, heightens the intrigue surrounding student claims of intimidation. However, I found that the level of intimidation singers feel about Baroque performance practice is directly related to their experience with using primary sources. The survey asked students if they had ever used a primary source to inform their performance of Baroque repertoire. While exactly half of graduate students had experience with primary sources, only about 10% of undergraduates had used a primary source. It is somewhat disconcerting that students who may not go on to the graduate level may also not be encouraged to gain the skills or the resources necessary to use primary sources to inform their performance. Primary sources seem to play a paradoxical role in this particular study, as they, on the one hand, facilitate informed performance practice and could therefore potentially perpetuate the notion of a Baroque voice. However, if thoroughly examined, the sources themselves hold the key to the freedom from such notions. Revisiting Mary Hunter's statement on the default early music voice, after my analysis, reveals one possible solution. At the time of writing, despite overwhelming evidence of enormous variability in the 17th and 18th centuries, the default early music voice in modern times has a light timbre, etc. Hunter is referring here to the wealth of historical accounts that suggest a diverse range of singers' fachs at the time these pieces were created. I therefore posit that a greater emphasis on primary sources during a singer's education may possibly impact the subtle yet stifling institutionalized notion of a Baroque voice. As Nick Wilson says in The Art of Reenchantment, this necessitates thinking more carefully about the best educational environment for stimulating the required mix of informed and accessible performance, rather than catering exclusively, say, for the promotion of musical intelligence. That Baroque repertoire was created for a certain fach is not historically accurate, and we know that composers were constantly adapting their compositions to accommodate different singers in various situations depending on who was available, rather than who had the voice best suited to the music. Ironically, the idolization of certain voice types in certain roles is therefore ahistorical, and may be hindering the progression of Baroque performance practices going forward. I offer the data collected in this study as a useful tool for further research into the notion of a Baroque voice, and how various music institutions can work with singers to encourage participation and enjoyment of the Baroque repertoire. My goal is not to argue against historical performance practice, but to recognize the misleading notions surrounding historical performance practice of Baroque repertoire, especially as they affect singers' perceptions of their own limitations. As Leon Botstein states in his article History and Performance Practices, an era of innocence and enthusiasm has passed, and as this study demonstrates, the repertoire seems to resonate as exclusive and intimidating for singers within a musical institution, and especially with voice types that do not fit Hunter's previously stated description. This lingering preference for a particular voice type may dissuade certain singers from pursuing Baroque solo vocal literature, and therefore ultimately stifle the future of Baroque opera and vocal repertoire in general. Therefore, I believe it is necessary to address this pervasive notion of a Baroque voice in order to promote Baroque solo vocal literature as an inclusive and accessible art form. Thank you very much for watching.